Hello everyone, on today's lecture for environmental assessment and circular economy, first model which we will be talking about the theoretical background and legislation. So as I already presented myself on the first introductory lecture. So as mentioned, we will be talking about environmental assessment, circular economy. But first, we need to find out why these topics are so important, what kind of legislation we have to follow, and what is the background that this legislation was even developed in the first place. So today's lecture content will be on environmental challenges and climate change, concepts of environmental protection. We will talk something about demographics and anthropogenic impact, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, external costs and polluter pay principles. And of course, we will focus on European Union Sustainable Investment Taxonomy and New Green Deal. After that, we will continue with environmental labels and we will make introduction into the measuring environmental impact. However, measuring environmental impact and the methods how to do it will be more in deeply investigated in the lecture number 2 and number 3. So, regarding the environmental impacts of industry, companies, organizations, we know that actually every kind of human activity causes some negative environmental impact. However, we cannot survive, we cannot live, we cannot develop without human activities. So we must be aware that all human activities will always cause some kind of environmental impact. And that's why our intention must be to minimize this impact as much as possible. So, first impact are of course emissions. We talk about that many times. It is also very well covered in the media. However, emissions, no matter that they are very famous and well covered in media, they're not the only part and negative impact that we cause as human beings with our daily activities. We have to be aware that one of the main issues for environmental protection is also energy use, especially fossil fuels and emission of carbon that was integrated in the fossil fuels. Then we have noise pollution, for example, because of construction, traffic, any kind of industrial processes and so on. People cannot sleep well, people are disturbed, animals need to move and are not able to use their original habitat because of the noise pollution. And this is also a very important environmental impact. Another one is, of course, the light pollution. Light pollution is also one of the impacts that we don't talk so much about it, but it is very important. The newest researchers show that negative impact can be identified also in the humans who don't sleep well because they have too much light pollution in their bedrooms, for example. There is also huge effect on aging faster because of the light pollution. We can see and we can investigate numerous cases where different plants and trees actually die before they should. Their lifespan is much shorter because of the light pollution. Then, of course, we have to talk also about the land use. Many times we talk about the renewable energy and how much better it is from the fossil fuels, which is completely true. However, when we want to install huge installations of photovoltaics power plants or wind power plants, we must be aware that this is also quite intensive regarding the land use. So we must find solutions which don't harm the environment too much. Then, of course, one of the main issues, material use and waste flows. So these are all environmental impacts. If we just name a few of them, the most important few of them, which we have to consider and which are one of the main concerns of humankind for our survival also of our societies. So first of all, if we talk about the emissions, let's see a few examples of what can be done and how. For example, if we know emissions in air, we know emissions in water, we know emissions in soil. However, the most famous are the emissions in air. Mainly we talk about carbon emissions, about CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions. We also know particle matters, which we are more and more concerned recently, but mainly the focus is on carbon emissions. So if we have, like, for example, a house where we use a household where we use where we are using heating oil for heating the house, and we spend approximately 2,000 liters of heating oil per year, that creates huge emissions in the environment. So what can we do? We can reduce our heating for 1 degree Celsius, and we can reduce the consumption for 6%. So that means approximately 120 liters of heating oil less, just if reducing the heat for 1 degree. However, this is, or how to say, this is one of the ways how to do it, but we can also change the technology. So if we, instead of heating oil, we use natural gas, we can reduce our emissions for 1,360 kilograms. So huge improvement, we can say. And we just made a small step from heating oil to the natural gas, which is once again a fossil fuel, but a little bit clearer one. If we want to go one step further, and we say that we are more environmentally aware, we don't like fossil fuels, we want to invest in renewables, we can install heat pump, for example. With a heat pump, we can create the same amount of energy, heat, and we can save up almost 2.5 tons of CO2. So this is already a huge amount. And if we talk about, I don't know, 1 million households, we can see that the contribution with just such a small change, so changing heating oil to natural gas or heat pump, could create huge contribution. The second one is the energy use. With energy use, when we talk about the impacts of the energy use, energy consumption, we always have in our minds such pictures as presented here on the slides. So usually thermal power plant with some fog or gases coming out of the chimneys. So that's like a very old school production of electricity. In these cases, many times we see intentions of replacing these resources, these production facilities, with renewables, with cleaner energy sources, which is of course great. However, there are numerous ways how to do that. We can replace fossil fuels or conventional energy sources with more nature friendly, so renewables, so photovoltaics, wind, or for example biofuels. However, we must be aware that these sources are a little bit are not that stable. So we can create electricity only when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining and so on. So this is not the best solution. We can increase efficiency. So instead of just creating electricity, we can use cogeneration, for example. So we can create heat and electricity simultaneously. On that way, we can increase efficiency of the process from 35% or 40%, and we can increase it to 70 or 80%. So huge increase and very, very big improvement. However, none of these solutions are not completely sustainable. So if we talk about the sustainable solution, we have to talk about the energy pyramid. So what is the energy pyramid? The energy pyramid is actually to start thinking not just how to replace this old power plant, but how to reduce the energy consumption. If we are talking about the sustainable energy consumption or sustainable energy industry, we have to focus first on the energy conservation, then on energy efficiency, and then in the last phase to replace these sources with renewables. So if you can see the energy pyramid, it should be based on the energy conservation. So the majority of energy that we spend today and is created mainly from, let's say, fossil fuels, we should reduce the amount of energy that we use. We should use energy more efficiently, and the energy that we still need should be created with renewable energy. If we just replace fossil fuels with new installations of renewables, and we just keep on increasing our energy use, this is of course not a sustainable solution, and that's why we cannot continue increasing and growing with energy need all the time. The third one is, as we talked, noise pollution. With the noise pollution, we also have some successful stories how to do it. We have, for example, limited speed, limited traffic in the city zones, limited traffic in the time of during the night, for example, during the hospital, in the vicinity of hospitals, and so on and so on. And we have also some fences. So all these ways are, for example, are very good examples how to fight with the noise pollution. However, once again, we have to think about the main source of the noise pollution, and we have to deal with the source. So not just reducing the noise pollution, but preventing it. Preventing measures are always better than just reducing it. Then we have the light pollution. So we can see on the picture on the right-hand side that old bulbs actually were quite good for lighting the streets, for example, but they also lighten the sky. So the newest bulbs or new lights are designed like that they reduce glare and the spillovers, and they just focus their light on the surface that they should, and not glowing in the sky. So what happens in this case is that the streets are better lightened, but the sky remains darker. So once again, we can stare in the skies and see the stars. So we can see here the graphical representation of the very bad, the bad light, so it doesn't glow directly up, but still it has big light pollution. Then we have that one which is also already much better, so that can light light down but not up. And we have the best one, the solution where we have the focus completely on the lighting, for example, street or the surface, but nothing else. Regarding the land use, we also talked that, for example, many times photovoltaics or even the windmills and so on are installed a little bit uncritically. So there we have a lot of cases where people are actually against the renewables because they are disturbing for their home community. So we have to be very careful and use photovoltaics, for example, mainly on the degraded areas. So we have numerous possibilities how to do that. For example, on the rooftops, for example, on the, I don't know, on the gas stations and so on. And we can also do it on the landfills, on the river banks, on the road banks. On, for example, we have cases of installing them on the railways and so on and so on. So wherever we cannot produce or we cannot make food, there is a good place to locate or to put photovoltaics. Otherwise, to put photovoltaics on arable land is not the most appropriate. There are some cases of good practices where we can install photovoltaics like on the figure above, and we have some nice meadows below them where we can where there could be a home of for example sheep or goats or something like that. But these cases could mislead to a very bad practice. They could be used very well, but in the majority of the cases, we should focus on installing photovoltaics on degraded areas. And of course, the material flow and wastes. Here we keep on focusing on how to recycle and how to let's say create something out of the waste. So we have good cases of for example, like here we have the Freitag bag where they create unique bags from old tarpaulins from the trucks. So old tarpaulins are very resilient. So they can be used for for bags that can last for decades. The seat belts are used for the belt. So it is created completely out of the waste material. However, this is only one of the solutions. Once again, we have to focus what is the cause of the pollution? What is the cause of huge amount of wastes? So we have to focus more on the preventive measures and not just on the recycling. And this is the change of mindset which we have to follow. Since we are too much focused on the recycling, we are dealing too much with the end of pipe approach, and we forget that we must solve the problem before it is even created. And this is only with preventing creation of the waste and with the sustainable production, and mainly with the sustainable consumption, which is not that easy to achieve. So why we have such a huge problems and environmental impacts as a human population? So one of the reasons is, like we can see here, because we have increased our population from 3 billion in 1960 to approximately 8 billion recently. So we could say that the population increased for 2.5-fold in just in just a very short time. So in a matter of 65 years. So you can see here also that with, for example, blue or green line here, you can see the world oil consumption and world oil production. It is also increasing. So we can see the population increases and more people need more energy because we need to create more clothes, we need to create more food, we need more cars, we need more, we are traveling more and so on and so on. So we can see that there is a big correlation between the use of energy, use of oil, and the population increase. Consequently, with the red dotted line, so this one here, we can see that world CO2 emissions are also increasing. So this is completely normal because if we spend more and more oil, we burn more fossil fuels. That means we create more and more CO2 emissions. However, we can see that we manage to create more and more GDP. So without with the growth of population and the growth of oil consumption, we create more and more GDP. So now the question is how to keep our GDP growth without using more and more materials and more oil. So this is actually a decoupling point that we all look for. So to revert the green, blue, and red curve back downwards and to still enable the GDP growth. So we talk here also many times, some economists speak about the degrowth challenges. So decoupling growth from material use and energy use. Sometimes we talk about degrowth as the concept of stop basing the economic growth on using environment for that. Sometimes, in many cases, we also see degrowth of stopping the growth if the growth must be based on the exploitation of environment. However, no matter that the population is growing, and we can see here with on this graph, for example, as well, that the GDP is growing faster than the population, we have a very strong correlation with the population growth and the resource extraction. So we need more energy, as seen here, and we need more material, as we see here. However, the humans are becoming more and more efficient. So we can see the purple line on the bottom, that we can create more and more out of the same amount of material. So out of 1 kilogram of steel, for example, we can create more efficient stuff. We can recycle it and so on. So we can create more and more. And now our focus is to revert once again the resource extraction as well. So we have to decrease the resource extraction and increase material and also increase the material efficiency, use of the material, and keep on working on the GDP growth. However, the GDP growth is not the best measure of measuring the country's development. It is one of the most important, and I don't believe that we can get rid of it so easily. The well-being economy concept, considering also numerous other indicators such as the social aspects, the environmental aspects, and economic aspects altogether, is, I believe, much better for more thorough evaluation of every economy. However, the GDP growth is accepted as the most influential and the most widespread indicator of the growth of the company or development, economic development of the company. That's why I believe that also all the solutions that will be developed must consider the GDP, at least at this moment. So the biggest challenges of the world, the rising population standard and standard is very well described in this video. So it's the Hans Rosling video, box by box, the growth of human population, which you can also watch and invest some more time in finding more about this interesting phenomenon. So, as mentioned, the world population has increased very, very rapidly in the recent 1.5 century. So, in the time of Roman Empire, there were less than 1 billion people in the world, so around 500 million people. Then we reached 1850. So the Industrial Revolution started. We created, as a humankind, we created more and more. We started to use more advanced energy sources. So out of the wood, we started using coal, we started using oil, we started using gas, and so on. We created the engines, steam engines, and so on. So the Industrial Revolution brought us huge improvement and development in the production of food, in the production of textiles. Everything became cheaper and more available. So this is what enabled the huge increase of the population. However, this population increase was so huge that in 1960s, 1970s, people started to realize that we are creating too big impact on the environment. So now it is already 50, 60 years from the beginnings of the first environmental protection acts and so on, more systematic ones. However, I would say that the progress in this field is still far from being sufficient. Now, when we have over 8 million people living in the world, and we have the forecasts that the population will increase up to 10 or 11 billion people living on the planet Earth, that means that we will need even more resources to feed all the people, to dress them up, to enable them, I don't know, for example, some kind of accommodation, transport, mobility, education, and everything. So in this case, carbon emissions are going to rise even further in the future. We can see here on the right-hand side the emissions during the historical period from 1850 till recent years. As we can see, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, UK was the leading industrial superpower. Then it was surpassed somewhere before some time before the 20th century started. United States of America surpassed them. And we can see here with the blue line the huge emissions created by the United States. However, here we can see also the rise of China. The Chinese economy started to flourish. And around in the last, let's say, 15 years or even 20 years, the China is creating much more CO2 emissions than United States, for example. So we have bigger and bigger emitters, and we have too much focus on the reducing carbon footprint. However, no matter that the Chinese are producing more carbon footprint than the United States or UK or any other country in the world, because they are the biggest emitters, we have to consider the population of the China and population of the United States. So United States with a population of approximately, let's say, 350 million people, or Chinese with population of 1,400,000,000 people, we can very easily calculate that the carbon footprint per capita in China is still much lower than in the United States. So we have to focus and we have to consider the cumulative emissions and per capita emissions. It is one very interesting theory that also relates to this field, and this is the theory limits of growth. So we are now living in 2025, and the population is still increasing. So we can see here with the green light, the population is increasing. The industrial output is very, very high. If it is on the maximal point already or not, we cannot be sure. Food production is also very high. The resources are decreasing. So, for example, the oil reserves, for example, the steel, some specific materials or some specific minerals or something like that. We can see that this is increasing. The arable land is also actually decreasing because of the desertification, because of the denutrification, because of the eutrophication, because of construction and loss of arable land, and so on and so on. So in the future, it is expected that because of the pollution, because of the too extensive resource extraction, because of too many people, and maybe some bad political decisions, we will achieve some kind of a collapse of this system. If we check statistical data, for example, for the United States, we can see that in some cases, people are already talking about the reduced potential or reduced or already shortening expected lifetime. We are already experiencing the decrease in expected education level. We have huge pollution levels which are causing more and more deaths, and because of the development of the medicine, we can somehow stabilize this. But if we would talk only about the some level of illness and impact of pollution on the human health, we could achieve very huge and negative numbers. And with the purple line, we can see the line of sustainability. And this one was already crossed. So it was crossed by the population, it was crossed by the industrial output, it was crossed by the food production. So whatever we do, whatever we create, we already came over the point of the sustainability. So we came over the point where planet Earth could regenerate itself, and we are actually using too many resources too extensively, and this is not sustainable on the long term, and this is not the way how we as a humankind could survive. Recently, that's why we are talking much and more about the climate changes. So the climate changes are actually the change of the climate in general. So this is not just increase of temperature for a few degrees in 1 year, but it is more like a systematic monitoring how the climate is changing during the longer period of time. At a decade ago, for example, in supply chain, which I'm covering as a professor for supply chain management, supply chain risk was primarily focused on the supplier failures, on the price volatility, component shortages, and so on. Recently, we see that the climate changes are actually causing the biggest and the most severe risks. And 2 out of 5 top risks are actually related on the environmental impact. We can see that the major coastal cities are equipped with significant port infrastructure, hinterlands that depend on port facilities for global trade. And from the supply chain perspective, lower inventory levels and constant circulation of supply is very vulnerable to disruptions if something happens to these coastal cities. If the sea level increases for 50 or 50 centimeters or 1 meter, we can see flooded ports, we can see flooded cities. We know what is the geographical situation in Netherlands. We know what is happening with the Venice, and this is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem are multi-million Asian cities which will have to develop new strategies how to adapt to the climate changes. And transport infrastructures are also highly vulnerable to the implications posed by the climate changes. So the climate changes are not just about changing the environment, but these climate changes are mainly so very drastic for us because they will completely change our population structure with new immigration flows from the lower parts of the world on the higher grounds of the world. They will additionally decrease the hectares of arable land for the food production. That's why the food price will increase. That's why the water price will increase. There will be more severe extreme weather conditions and shortages, and this is what really matters, and this is why we have to fight and tackle climate changes. So why climate changes are actually happening and what is the anthropogenic cause behind it? So we always had, for example, some kind of eruption or emissions of carbon emissions. We also had some different kind of sinks or greenhouse gases like forests, oceans, plankton, permafrost, and so on and so on. But this actually functioned in a very well balanced system, circulating in the atmosphere, coming down in the earth, getting in the ocean, being stored in the ocean or in the forest, and so on and so on. During the millions of years, old forests were changed their form, and old forests became coal. After that, they became oil or gas, depends from the time period and the pressure behind it. And this was all stored below the ground, below the sea. And these stored oil reserves or fossil fuel reserves were actually some kind of a sink of carbon emissions as well. And why this is so problematic? Because this well-balanced system was now destructed by the human interfering in it by digging out the coal reserves and oil reserves and start burning them. And when we started to burn them, this created some kind of an imbalance. We don't have sufficient sinks of greenhouse gases, and that's why the concentration of CO2 is increasing. We can see recently that the CO2 emissions increasing are quite well correlated with the increase of the global temperatures. And that's why we can confirm that increased CO2 emissions, increased carbon emissions are actually causing the climate changes. So what is going to happen and what are the predictions? The predictions are not that very positive. We cannot stop the climate changes anymore. However, we can adapt to them and we can mitigate them. So we have the climate agreement, Paris Agreement, well-known Paris Agreement, which is focused on reducing the climate changes, on increasing the global temperature up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And even in this case, we face a sea level rise of quite some meters. Only limiting the warming to the 1.5 degrees gives us a chance to limit sea level rise to around 1 meter in the long run. However, even if we remain on the 1.5 degrees Celsius, the probability of reaching critical tipping points, for example, for Greenland or Antarctic ice sheets and so on, are very high. The tipping points are, of course, uncertain, but the estimates lie that it is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So that's why it is so important to limit the climate changes and the global warming to the 1.5 degrees. However, the recent data show us that we already achieved 1.5 degrees in the last few years. So this is not yet the long-term data, so that doesn't mean that the climate has changed for 1.5 degrees, but it is very clear in which way we are going. So that's one of the reasons why some countries created some kind of climate pledges. These are information, or these are the data, the climate pledges from 2018 or 2019. We can see that mainly only European countries has made some commitment on the climate pledges. We have some other countries also, like Japan, Australia, Brazil, and Canada that followed, but the majority of the rest of the world is colored in red or black color. So that means no pledges or no emission reduction targets yet. After a few years, the situation has improved, and situation at the end of 2021 was that we have only one country that is compatible with the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. This is Gambia. All the rest, as you can see, are insufficient or highly insufficient. Also, European Union, Germany, Japan, Norway, Switzerland, for example, well-developed countries, also United States. So countries which are leading the global development are still insufficient regarding the climate pledges. If we consider the fair share, so that means that the lower income countries contribute less rich developed countries contribute more, especially considering the historical perspective. We see that there is more than just one country compatible with the Paris Agreement. So the Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Kenya, Morocco, Nepal, Nigeria, and the Gambia. However, the rest of the world is still more or less insufficient. So that means that we are going towards +3 or +4 degrees Celsius. So can you imagine what would happen with us if we would have, instead of 36.5 degrees Celsius our temperature, we would have 39.5 or 40 degrees Celsius. We are very, very sick in that case. And the same situation could be implemented also in the environment. The environment can also not so easily handle increase for 3 or 4%. So that means that we will have the climate of Turkey will be the climate of the Central Europe, the climate of the equatorial states will be the climate of the Turkey, and what is going to happen in the hottest parts of the world is still very questionable. Climate changes will be more influential for some parts of the world, less influential for the other parts of the world. However, increasing the average temperature for 3 or 4 degrees would have severely negative impact on our not just environment, but especially on our society and on the possibility of humankind to survive. So the recent climate targets are already updated, and we can see that there were severe improvements. In the first continent starting, or the first, let's say, part of the world stated that they will become climate neutral was the European Union. That European Union created a plan how to become climate neutral by 2050. A few years after that, China also announced that they will be climate neutral by 2060. So we have many places in the world which are following this agenda. However, there are some places in the world as well which are sometimes following the agenda, sometimes start to fighting against this agenda. So we all know who we are talking about. And the lack of commitment, of the global commitment towards the Paris Agreement, is the biggest challenge of implementing these climate targets, because this is not something that only one country or one continent could contribute to and would achieve huge benefits, but it must be done hand by hand with all of us, since this is a global problem, not just a state or country specific problem. So nationally determined contribution updates by 2022, we can see that more and more, or almost all countries, are already having some goals for the fighting climate changes and tackling them. So how to survive it? It is very hard. However, we have to focus that while China is expected to reach peak in emission pollution by 2030 and is expected to achieve carbon neutrality in 2060, their political system is actually enabling them to make huge cuts in the carbon emissions, because they can easily just stop the production of very harmful or environmentally disputable electricity if they don't follow and if they don't, if they are not focused toward achieving the goals. So also the political system is one of the things that must be considered when talking about the achieving climate pledges. However, this is something out of the scope of this debate. So let's follow. Let's keep up with the topic that we have here. Regarding the goals that followed the Paris Agreement, I would also like to mention the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals are actually the 17 goals that were created to achieve the big movements or the big improvements in the environment, in the social, and also in the economic area till 2030. All of these goals could be divided also on these three areas. So we can divide them on the economical, social, and biosphere-related goals. As we can see, there are 4 goals related to economic, there are 4 goals related to the biosphere, and there are 8 of them related to the society. We have to be aware that the climate changes will not destruct the environment only, but the climate changes will have the most negative impact on the human society. The nature will find a way to reproduce, to recreate, and to develop also in the future. However, the survival of the society and the humankind is not that easy to achieve. So one of the strategic documents in this field is are also the 6 pillars of the European strategic development. Developed in 2018 and valid for 2019 to 2024, European Union developed a new Green Deal. So the aim to be the first climate neutral continent and resource efficient economy. So why are we so focused on being resource efficient? Because European Union is having huge problems with natural resources. We have huge problems because we are very energy dependent from natural gas. We are energy dependent from oil. We are energy dependent from uranium for the nuclear power plants. We are also dependent from different minerals and scarce materials and so on and so on. So it is not just it is not just because we are more environmentally friendly people in Europe, but we also have to be pragmatic. We need circular economy more than some others. We need renewable energy more than others because we don't have our own resources. So if we want to be independent and self-sufficient, we have to change our economy and our way of living. There will also different pillars focusing on the digitalization, on economy works for people, stronger Europe, promoting European way of life and European democracy. And of course, this was now upgraded to the new strategic agenda for 2024 to 2029. And here we have 3 priority areas: a free and democratic Europe, strong and secure Europe, and prosperous and competitive Europe. So the new Green Deal is still one of the most important issues. Promoting green and digital transition is one of the main motivators or main pushes for the competitive Europe. So bolstering competitiveness of European Union is mainly based on the green and digital transition. However, Now we also talk more about stronger and secure Europe and comprehensive approach to some foreign affairs. So the three pillars of European Union industrial transition are green transition, digital transition, and global competitiveness based on these two. If we talk about the environmental risks that we are facing, we can see here that already in 2020, so 5 years ago, the majority of like big CEOs found out that there are actually extreme heat waves and destruction of natural heat ecosystems are two of the most important 2 out of 5 most important risks, short-term risks for the future. So we see economic confrontation, political polarization, heat waves, destruction of ecosystem, and cyber attacks. So 2 out of 5 are actually related with climate changes and environmental destruction. So here I have also some questions to study for you. So the technological trends that will influence the future. What does it matter to know demographic changes? Why companies have to adapt and mitigate these changes? How can one small change impact the whole supply chain or the life cycle? What trends can be seen in our daily life and are related with the green and digital transition, and so on and so on. So these are the questions to study in your individual part. And now let's continue with the European Green Deal. So the European Green Deal is, as mentioned, let's say an action plan how to achieve climate neutral continent by 2050. So we want to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. What is the base for this is that European Union wants to transform to a modern and resource efficient competitive economy. We have huge problems now because we are too much import dependent on the gas, on the oil, on resources. So that's why if we want to become more independent and more resilient and more competitive, we need more renewable resources that we can handle and we can create, and especially energy by ourselves. So the European Green Deal is actually mentioning that we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, that we have no net emissions by greenhouse gases by 2050, that we can adapt fully to the impacts of the climate change by 2050, which is also a very challenging one, that we will protect our natural capital, so the ecosystems and so on, and that we will consider the health and well-being of citizens from environment-related risks. The focus is on the smart and sustainable mobility, renovation of buildings, energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, circular economy, and reducing emissions. When we talk about the, for example, Green Deal, there is also one very interesting theory, the donut economy, developed by the Reform. So this donut economy actually shows us here on the right-hand side. This green part is the safe and just space for humanity. So if we create too much impacts on the environment, we overshoot, for example, one of these impacts, so the climate change, ozone layer depletion, air pollution, biodiversity, land conversion, fresh water withdrawals, nitrogen loading, chemical pollution, or something like that, we create very negative impact and we reduce the safe and just we reduce the possibility of humanity to live in the safe and just space. On the other hand, we contribute also to the social foundations: health, food, water, energy, networks, housing, gender equality, social equality, political voice, justice, peace, education. So in this case, we can also create a shortfall of these social foundations. So overshooting ecologicals is actually creating the shortfall on the socials. If we have climate changes, we have some kind of pollution and so on, we can create huge shortfall in the social foundations. So this might be very tricky. Oops. And that's why we are focused now in environmental management and measuring what we are actually doing. We know the famous saying that what is not measured is not managed. So that means if we don't know what is happening and we are not measuring some impacts on the environment, we cannot manage them. So first we needed to develop tools and methodological approaches how to measure impacts, and then in the second phase we can start controlling and managing it. So we first need to know environmental problems, then we need to know what are the alternatives and how to implement. Environmental management is therefore a process with which organizations evaluate and audit how their activities and business processes affect their environment. In the second phase, they implement actions to minimize or remove these negative impacts. Environmental management actually enables monitoring and controlling the impacts in combination with the goal of their minimization. It is only effective if implemented systematically and in all business functions. So, environmental management is taking care of environmental problems and environmental challenges, managing external costs, monitoring energy use, water use, material use, waste flows, and following different standards. The most well-known standards here are the ISO 14000 series and EMAS standards, which are integrated by not so very huge amount of companies because they're much stricter, and the EMAS standard holders need to report improvements in every year of having this standard, because otherwise, if they don't make any improvement, they can lose it. So if we first go to the external costs and we talk about what is this external costs. So the external costs are negative and potentially positive environmental and social costs evaluated in monetary terms that are not considered in company balance sheet. So that means if we have a negative effect of third party from, for example, from the production or consumption of a good, that is external costs. As an example, we have here like a radiation from nuclear power plant, or we have like the waste landfill constructed next to our house. So that means that our house or real estate will be worth much less in over the night, because there is some kind of one of the investors who will build a landfill next to our house, and because no one wants to live next to the landfill, our real estate will be worth less. So this is also one of the cases of external costs. One of the cases of external cost is also if there is some kind of a noise pollution in the industry hall next door to us, or there is some kind of a pollution of the air and it impacts our health, for example, our quality of sleeping and so on. This is also external cost. So this is some kind of a negative environmental and social impact that is not included in the company's balance sheet. So the idea is actually now to start with the internalization of the external costs. So what does it mean? External costs that are not included in company balance sheet should be in the future included. So we have here the representation of current price of different products. So the false price, because external costs are not included. So if these external costs will be included, the true price will be much higher for some products. So that means that some products or some services which are more environmentally disputable will not be economic anymore. And on the other hand, some solutions which are now too expensive will become much more feasible in the future. As a case, we can see, for example, different energy sources. So we can see here levelized costs and external costs of different energy sources on the right side. So if we see the levelized cost of the production costs, we can see that, for example, geothermal and coal have the lowest costs. So that means we could invest, if we would follow the costs only, we would invest in the geothermal, in the coal production of electricity from coal. However, if we include here on the right-hand side, we can see that coal external costs can be between 75 and almost 150 euros per megawatt hour. So that means that the total price would be between 150 and 2025 euros per megawatt hour. So that means that the coal electricity from coal would be the most expensive of all of them. On the other hand, we can see that, for example, wind, hydro, geothermal, and also solar have quite low external costs. So that means that if we combine the levelized costs and external costs, we could get completely different perspective of which energy sources are actually feasible for the production of energy and which are much more expensive. This is also something that is included in the newest European Union legislation. So the newest European legislation is actually based on Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. It promotes sustainable investments and wants to reduce environmental impact. It's an establishment of some technical committees to develop technical standards for sustainable activities and strengthen the green economy and supporting the transition to a low-carbon economy. It is actually working with financial institutions to create sustainable investment opportunities. So in the past, we were having sustainable different legislation, which is now a little bit changed. So since 2022, the focus is Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. So large companies and listed companies will have to report about their impacts on the environment from 2024 on. So this year they will start reporting for the last year. And this is one of the very important issues, because here companies will have to monitor their impacts systematically and they will have to report it to the authorities. This is one of the basements for the European taxonomy, which is actually a taxonomy of sustainable investments. So it's actually a classification system aimed at investors and companies, institutions, policymakers, helping them to establish if and how one activity can be considered as environmentally sustainable. If we want to become climate neutral by 2050, we must know first which investments are more and which investments are less sustainable. So the European taxonomy, therefore, is intended to facilitate the allocation of capital towards sustainable activities and projects, to support the Green Deal and to support the final goal of becoming carbon neutral. Undoubtedly, the European Union taxonomy is a landmark regulation that will initiate a paradigm shift in how business operates, and it can enable us the better future. However, the tricky part is once again because it is only obligatory for companies in the European Union. However, in 2028, it will become obligatory also for the foreign companies that create certain amount of income within the European Union. So that means that it will balance once again the competitiveness of European companies and foreign companies. However, European companies will at the beginning be a little bit less competitive because of that. However, the idea is that on the long term, this could bring them additional global competitiveness. So let's hope that it will work that way for us. So how does the EU taxonomy works? It actually has a set of 4 general conditions that an economic activity must meet in order to be considered as environmentally sustainable. So first of all, we have 6 objectives, and every economic activity must make substantial contribution to one of those 6 objectives. If it makes substantial contributions to one of them, it must simultaneously, it should not do any significant harm to the other 5 of them. Along with that, it must comply with minimal safeguard standards. So that means the compliance with the human rights and so on, and comply with the applicable technical screening criteria. Who does it concern? At the moment, it concerns large companies, financial markets, and European member states. So as mentioned, we have Paris Agreement, we have Green Deal, we have numerous legislative forms of legislation, but all of them were actually excluding the money, so the banks and the funds, investment funds. And the European Union taxonomy is also covering banks and investment funds. So that means that it is not just about the industry, it is also about the flow of money. So if you cover the banks and investment funds, you can also manage where banks and investment funds will invest their money to. So all the investments that will be more sustainable will be more interesting for the investments. So this is the big idea behind it. So if there will be one investment will be European economy, European Union taxonomy aligned, it will be able to get better financing for it. It will be able to be tagged as European economy aligned, and so on and so on. So it will bring additional benefits to the companies and investment funds. So how does it need to be done? It is actually like identification of climate-related risks, definition of climate scenarios that affect the asset, evaluation of the effectiveness of countermeasure, and evaluation of risk reduction. So all of this is done in different steps. So as mentioned, sustainable finance taxonomy goals are 6. The best developed are first 2 of them, so the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So the rest, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems are following. So every investment that we wanted to be a sustainable taxonomy aligned must have substantial contribution to one of those 6 objectives. Simultaneously, it should not do any harm to the other of them. So that means if one project or one investment will have very good and substantial contribution to, for example, to circular economy, but on the other hand, it will increase the pollution and it will, I don't know, for example, decrease the biodiversity and the protection of ecosystems, it will not be European Union taxonomy aligned. If something will make substantial contribution and no significant harm to all the rest of 5 of them, but will not comply with the labor rights or combating bribery, bribe solicitation, extortion, and so on, so UN guiding principles on business and human rights, then again, it will not be EU taxonomy aligned. So that's why companies will need to follow different rules, and these rules will need to be considered within the whole supply chain, not just in the one part of the world. So that's why I think it could make a huge contribution. But the tricky part is because there are numerous more and more numerous, let's say, forces that want to destruct this background of European Union taxonomy idea. So the 6 pillars, as mentioned already, the first 2 are related with climate change. The third one is sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, then circular economy, pollution prevention, and healthy ecosystem. So how to start? First of all, we do the determining taxonomy eligibility. So we first need to know whether our company is eligible or not for European Union taxonomy. So the screening criteria exist for our activity or not. Are we a big company or not? If we are a big company, then we might be eligible. If we are not a big company, we are a very small company, we are not on the stock market, then we are not eligible so far. We might be eligible in the coming years. Then we have the technical screening phase. So does the activity substantially contribute to climate change mitigation or not? So if it does, do we have any significant harm requirements or not? Does the activity comply with the minimal social safeguards or not? And so on and so on. So there is like a roadmap that we can follow to comply with these standards. When we did this, when we are on that way, we have to focus on, for example, our portfolio. And many times we can find out that from all the portfolio, there are, let's say, in this case, 82% of investments are not eligible, 18% of them are eligible. And for those that are eligible, we have to find out how many of them is aligned with the European Union taxonomy, how many of them is potentially aligned, and and how many of them is not aligned. And we can make improvements in these cases. So let's take a look in one example of European Union taxonomy. As mentioned, I'm working on the supply chain management, so I will tell you something about the warehouses of the future and warehouses compliant with the European taxonomy. So let's say that we have one company that started to that increased their production because the demand for their products is increasing. So because of the increased demand and production, they would need a new warehouse to store their goods. So they have three different possibilities. They can construct a new warehouse, they can buy one warehouse, or they can renovate an existing one. In every case, they need to consider different criteria to be European Union taxonomy aligned. So, for example, if they want to construct a new warehouse, they need to consider the following. The facility should not be used for the extraction, storage, transportation, or production of fossil fuels. If any kind of fossil fuels is related with the warehouse, then automatically it cannot be EU taxonomy aligned. So we want to get rid of the fossil fuels. That's the main idea behind it. Then, if we want to construct a new warehouse, we have very strict rules about the energy efficiency and so on the national levels. However, the warehouse constructed and aligned with the European Union taxonomy should have the annual primary energy demand at least 10% lower than prescribed by the national legislation. So these are the two main criteria for the warehouses if we want to build a new one. So if we want to build a new one, we will really have to make it very, very energy efficient and not related with fossil fuels. So if we say, okay, I don't want to build a new one. I'm not so interested in building such a energy efficient building. What about if we renovate our existing one? So once again, if we renovate it, the building should once again not be used for the extraction, storage, transport, or production of fossil fuels. So it doesn't matter if we build a new one. If we renovate it, we should not relate it with fossil fuels in any case. Then, energy efficient renovation. Once again, we have to be compliant with minimal legal requirements for the major renovation in the local or national legislation. So once again, we will need to renovate it in accordance with high energy efficiency standards. Okay, we have an investor and the investor says, okay, I don't want to build a new one. I think that this kind of renovation is also too complicating for me. I will buy a warehouse which is already completed. In this case, the existing building, so if you buy a building which is built before the end of 2020, it must have a minimal class A energy performance certificate, or the energy demand must correspond to the top 15% of the national building stock, which is data that is quite hard to get. If it is built after the end of 2020, it has the same requirements as the new construction. So that means even if you want to build it, even if you want to buy it, it must have minimal Class A energy performance certificate, so it must be very high energy efficient, or it must be done as a new building. So what I want to say is that it is impossible to get rid of the high standards for the energy efficiency. It is impossible to get rid of the restriction of not using it for the fossil fuels. So with European Union taxonomy, we can see how it will affect, for example, a simple real estate like warehouse, how it will affect the whole supply chains, because this will start to exclude fossil fuels out of it, and it will become more and more energy efficient in the coming years. So in general, environmental auditing is precondition to assess which activities are environmentally sound, to present which products are more or less sustainable, and for that we can also use some environmental tags. So what are the environmental tags and why we use it? If we have environmental label on the product, it shows us something, it tells us something. So environmental labels, initial intention is to be informative. If we talk, for example, about the warehouse that has very low energy consumption, we need some kind of an energy tag to prove that, because if we want to, let's say, buy a new warehouse, we will not measure the energy consumption, but we would need some certificate that will prove that if we buy this kind of a building, that it is sustainable EU investment taxonomy aligned, and that we will not spend too much money on the electricity or heat consumption after we buy it. It has some educational promotional value. It can enable some differentiation. So for example, if we buy a bio product, organic product, the price could be maybe higher, because we can sell it for a bigger price because it has some added value. So it is also a case of strategy of differentiation. It could be precondition for the business. So like we mentioned, for the example, for the warehouse, it must be Class A. For green public tenders, for example, Forest Stewardship Council tax is a precondition many times. And it is also added value for the product. So for example, maybe compostable bags for the organic wastes, it is definitely an added value for the product. So we have different environmental tags, for example, for the food items, certified sustainable seafood, ecological, without genetical modifications, and so on, different types for food items. We also have different types for many numerous other items. So for the food items are maybe the most well known, because we meet with these tags daily. We can see it also with the biodegradable tag on the back, and with the Forest Stewardship Council, so this FSC, so the packaging made from sustainable sourced paper or wooden product. We have, again, energy tax, for example, for the household appliances. We have energy tax for tires. We have Energy Star, for example, for household appliances as well. And we have we have this energy certificate of the building, which assesses how much energy the building will need, what are the emissions, what is the energy for the operating of the building, and so on and so on. What are the potential actions for the improvements, and so on. And all of these, as mentioned, are some kind of a text that give us some value, that gives some value to the customer, some informative value, what is happening and how the product was developed. Is the product more sustainable or less sustainable, and so on. On the other hand, we have also some environmental tags that are a little bit more systematic or more comprehensive. So here I am thinking about the European Union Ecolabel, the Blue Angel, Nordic Swan Ecolabel, for example. All of these are actually considering the life cycle perspective. So that means that if a product has this label on it, it means that it was made by the improvements within the whole life cycle of the product. So considering in the first stage, the raw material production of the product, distribution, use phase, and the end of life. We have also different types of tags for the fair trade, for the textile, for the wooden or paper products, and so on and so on. So increasing awareness and knowledge. Why does that matter? Because if we increase awareness on the environmental consciousness, if we increase awareness of environmental challenges, if we increase awareness of what are the potential sustainable investments and what are potential greenwashing activities, we can more efficiently tackle the climate change, and we can have better transparency for our future decision making. Information on impacts must be based on standardized methodology, such as, for example, carbon footprint, such as, for example, life cycle assessment, such as, for example, water footprint or ecological footprint or something like that. And this kind of methodologies gives us a valuable insight which products are more and which products are less sustainable. And for those consumers, for those users that has high environmental awareness, this enables them the possibility to choose the product which has lower impact on the environment. So it also gives us the possibility to make the change, because many times we are not aware what kind of product or which product is better, which is worse. Simple case of this is, for example, a plastic bag for single use. We have seen, for example, that plastic bags for single use are not good for the environment. However, if we want to use those bags for the multiple use, we have to use it at least 130 times to be more environmentally friendly than the single use bag. So something to consider till the next time we see each other, because many times we just buy the multiple purpose bag and we use it maybe 5 times or 10 times, then we throw it away or forget about it or something like that. So in this case, we made much bigger contribution to the environmental impacts than with the single-use bags. So the single-use bags were once let's say compared to the pimples on the skin of the teenager. So they are problematic, they look very bad, but they are not the core of the environmental problems. Same as the teenager's skin is not the core of the health of the person. What I want to say is that when we talk about environmental issues, about environmental problems, we must dig deeper. We must evaluate and monitor what is happening to be able to find out the hotspot and to be able to find out which problems are the most influential for the environment. When we get this information, we can focus on solving it and decreasing the impact on the environment based on the data where we have the biggest problems and not just on the first sight what looks worse. So that's why I wanted to present you the case of the plastic bag, because the plastic bag, we have lots of plastic bags in the environment, unfortunately. In some countries, some cultures, for example, in Asia, in India, the situation is very bad. In other countries, situation is much better. However, this is not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is too big consumption. The core of the problem is too big consumption of fossil fuels. The core of the problem is that we don't care much about the environment. So these are the core problems, not the plastic bags. And the plastic bags are too many times used just for the greenwashing. So the environment usually appears as a threat to the business in various forms, as a public pressure from individuals, non-NGOs, regulation, cost for cleaning, for example, a liability for damages cost, and so on and so on. So responsibility for the product throughout its life cycle is something that producers must consider already when designing a product. And now what is happening is that many companies are seeing environment as a value added and as some kind of a strategy for achieving long-term profits, because working hand in hand with the environment actually brings them additional benefits of lower costs for the waste management, lower production costs, lower material costs, lower energy costs, and so on, better image, and so on. And that's why environment is actually becoming also a business opportunity. So what we want to do is to make a progress toward environmental goals, raw materials, energy use, emission in transport, waste amounts, efficiency of use of materials, number of environmental incidents, accidents, proportion of recycled waste, materials recycled and used for packaging, number of kilometers driven by vehicles per unit, for example, reduction of hazardous pollutants, investments in environmental protection, and the use of space. So different methods, as mentioned, are there for us to enable us to assess as objectively as possible our environmental impact. Some of them are presented here: the carbon footprint, ecological footprint, water footprint, life cycle assessment, and so on and so on. So different methods have different pros and cons, and in the next lecture we will find out more about the carbon footprint, and then we will follow with the ecological footprint. But first of all, I would like you to do the task for today's lecture. So I want you to study the European Economic Compass that provides visual representation of the context of the European Union taxonomy. It makes the content of the European Union taxonomy easier to assess for a variety of users. So check your company, or I don't know, just consider one product or one service and find out for that product or service or the company that you're working in, which alternatives are activities are included in the EU taxonomy. So which are taxonomy eligible activities, to which objectives they substantially contribute, and what criteria have to be met for activities to be considered taxonomy aligned. It is also important to note that minimum standards safeguards like social standards have to be met. So EU Taxonomy Compass aims to make it easier to integrate the criteria into business databases and other IT systems. So your final output should be to prepare a report with core findings. What are activities that are included? Which objectives you need to consider, and what criteria have to be met for a specific company or product or service. So that would be all from my side for this theoretical background, legislative background, EU taxonomy, Green Deal, and the background for the future monitoring of environmental impacts.